I was 16 when I learned that a suicide note could be forged, and that the man who forged it could stand at my mother's funeral and cry while everyone comforted him. My father, Conrad, was a novelist. He wrote thrillers about women who disappeared, who broke, who left behind mysteries for men to solve. And when my mother actually disappeared, when she actually broke or was broken, he wrote her ending too. 2 sentences, elegant, impersonal, nothing like the woman who filled journals with bird observations and grocery lists and descriptions of light through windows. I spent 15 years learning to hear her real voice, and then I spent 8 months writing my father's confession in his own stolen words. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, my name is Vesper, and this is the story of how I ghostwrote my father's autobiography and made it his indictment. If this channel has ever made you feel less alone, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week, and if you're watching because someone wrote your mother's ending without her permission, stay until the end. I need you to hear how this ends. Here's my story. My mother Helena was not a quiet woman. I say this because almost no one who met her after my father would believe it. By the time I was old enough to notice, she had learned to be quiet, to move through Conrad's world like a shadow, to speak only when spoken to make herself small in rooms where he needed to be large. But I found her journals when I was 10, hidden in a cedar chest under her winter clothes, and I read the voice of a woman who had never been quiet at all. She wrote about everything. The particular way a sparrow landed on the fence at 6:47 a.m., 3 days in a row, and what it might mean. The argument she had with the grocery clerk about whether the tomatoes were ripe, and how the clerk's defensiveness reminded her of her own mother. The light through the kitchen window at 4 p.m. in October, the color of old honey, the color of memory, the color of a time before I understood that marriage was a slow process of becoming invisible. She wrote about my father too, though never by name. C found my notebook today. He read it. He said my observations were charming but not serious writing. He said I should focus on being a mother. He said he would help me by showing my little stories to his editor to see if they were worth anything. I said no. He took them anyway. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they were rejected or if he never sent them. I only know that when I asked, he said I should be grateful he tried, and that I was too sensitive about my little hobby. I read this when I was 11. I didn't understand it fully, but I understood enough to hide the journals deeper, to never mention them, to protect my mother's only private space from my father's appropriation. She died when I was 16. Or rather, she was found dead, in the bathtub, wrists opened, empty pill bottles on the tile. The note was on her phone, 2 sentences. I have given everything I had. Forgive me. I read it at the police station, while an officer watched me with the particular pity reserved for children who have lost parents. I read it 3 times. Then I said, "This isn't my mother's voice." The officer nodded, the way adults nod at grieving children who say impossible things. Grief changes how we remember people, sweetheart. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we know least. I didn't argue. I was 16, in shock, wearing clothes I had grabbed without thinking, my father's voice in the hallway explaining to someone that Helena had been unwell for some time, that he had tried to get her help, that he was devastated but not surprised. I knew 2 things in that moment. First, my mother had not written that note. Second, no one would believe me. I became a linguist. Not immediately. I went to college, dropped out, worked as a barista, as a transcriptionist, as anything that kept me alive while I tried to understand what I had lost. Then I found forensic linguistics, the particular science of identifying voices through patterns invisible to casual reading. Stylometry, the frequency of certain words, the length of sentences, the particular rhythm of punctuation. Authorship analysis, the statistical fingerprint that makes a writer recognizable even when they try to hide. I went back to school. I finished. I got a job with a private investigation firm, analyzing threatening letters, forged documents, disputed wills. I was good at it. I had been training since I was 11, reading my mother's journals, learning her voice so well that I could recognize it even in fragments, even in disguise. And I read my father's books, all of them. The thrillers that had made him famous, the complex female characters that critics praised, the psychological insights that won awards. I read them with the tools I had learned, and I found my mother everywhere. Not her name, not her story, but her voice. The particular observation about light through windows, reused as a murderer's poetic reflection. The argument with the grocery clerk, transformed into a femme fatale's backstory. The sparrow on the fence, appearing in 3 different novels as a symbol of fragile hope. My father had been stealing from her for decades. Not just her notebooks, her voice, her way of seeing, her particular genius for making the ordinary luminous. He had taken her private observations and made them public, her intimate thoughts and made them profitable, her way of being in the world and made it his artistic vision. And when she discovered this, when she threatened to expose him, to publish her own work, to claim her own voice, he had written her suicide note and made it her final words. I couldn't prove the last part, not with the tools I had. The police had closed the case. The note was consistent with a depressed woman's final communication, according to the report I eventually obtained through legal channels. The pills were hers, prescribed by a psychiatrist Conrad had selected. The method, wrists and pills together, was suggestive of serious intent. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, just a woman who had given everything she had, asking for forgiveness. I read my mother's journals again, all of them, the ones I had saved and the ones I found later in a storage unit Conrad had forgotten to clear. She was not depressed. She was angry, active, planning. In the final months, she had contacted a lawyer about copyright infringement. She had found an editor interested in her work. She had written in her last journal entry 3 days before her death, "I am finally ready to be loud again. C will not like this, but I am done being his source material." She was not done. He was done with her. I waited. I built my career. I became known in forensic linguistic circles as someone who could identify a forged document, a ghostwritten memoir, a plagiarized passage with statistical certainty. I testified in court. I published papers. I built the particular credibility that would be necessary for what I planned to do, and I watched my father. He thrived in the decade after my mother's death. The Silent Wife, his most personal work, about a woman who commits suicide and leaves her family in peace, was published when I was 26. It won the National Book Award. It was optioned for a film. Conrad appeared on television, crying about his journey through grief, his artistic transformation, his debt to Helena, who taught me what love and loss really mean. I read the book once. I recognized my mother's suicide note, almost word for word, woven into the narrative as the protagonist's final letter. "I have given everything I had, forgive me." In the novel, it was poignant, devastating, the voice of a woman who understood that her greatest gift was her own absence. In reality, it was 2 sentences written by a man who needed his wife to be quiet forever. I did not confront him. I did not sue. I had no standing, no evidence that would survive discovery, no lawyer who would take a case based on stylistic analysis of a suicide note. I waited. I planned. I became patient in the particular way of a woman who understands that justice is not an event but a process, not a verdict but a construction. The opportunity came when Conrad announced his autobiography. A raw and honest account of my life, my art, my marriage, and my loss, the press release said. The definitive statement from one of America's most important novelists. He needed a ghostwriter. His agent put out feelers, and I made sure that the feelers reached me. I did not approach him directly. That would have been suspicious, the daughter he had not spoken to in 5 years, offering to write his life story. Instead, I created Ava, a young writer with an MFA from Iowa, a few published stories in literary magazines, and a particular admiration for Conrad's brave honesty about difficult subjects. I built her social media, her portfolio, her references. I made her real enough to pass any background check, any interview, any scrutiny. Conrad's agent loved her. Fresh voice, the agent told Conrad, admires your work deeply, understands what you're trying to do with this book. Conrad interviewed me, Ava, over coffee in his Manhattan apartment. He was 60 now, still handsome in the weathered way that television preferred, still performing the particular humility of a man who has been told he is great too many times. He talked about his need for authenticity, his desire to finally tell the truth, his debt to Helena, who deserves to be remembered properly. I nodded. I took notes. I smiled with the particular admiration he expected, and I felt nothing, not anger, not grief, not the revenge I had imagined for 15 years. Just focus. The particular focus of a linguist who has found her subject, a daughter who has found her mother's killer, a writer who has finally found her story. He hired me. 8 months of interviews, of drafts, of finding his voice, which was ironic, because I had spent 15 years proving that he had never had one. I wrote the autobiography he wanted, or rather, I wrote the autobiography he thought he wanted. Chapter by chapter, I constructed a narrative that followed the shape of his expectations: childhood ambition, early struggles, artistic breakthrough, marriage and its complexities, tragedy and transformation. The shape he had performed in interviews, in award speeches, in the particular theater of his public life. But inside that shape I placed the truth. Not stated truth can be denied, edited, explained away. I placed it in the evidence. In the stylistic analysis that showed, page by page, how his complex female characters matched my mother's journals with statistical certainty. In the timeline that showed his books appearing months after her notebook entries. In the testimonies of editors, who had rejected Helena's submissions and accepted Conrad's versions of the same material. I wrote it as Conrad's voice, or rather, as the voice he had constructed from my mother's stolen words. I made him confess without knowing he was confessing. I made him expose himself in the particular way of a man who has spent his life performing honesty and cannot recognize the real thing. The chapter on Helena was the center. I wrote it as Conrad's tribute to her, his memories of their marriage, his grief, his artistic debt. But I embedded in it the full text of her final journal entry, juxtaposed with the suicide note, analyzed with the tools I had spent 15 years developing. The note was not her voice. The journal was, and the gap between them was the space where my father had acted. I did not accuse him of murder. I did not need to. I simply showed, with the precision of forensic linguistics, that the woman who wrote about sparrows and grocery arguments and the color of October light could not have written "I have given everything I had. Forgive me." And I showed that the man who claimed to have loved her had spent his career turning her private voice into public profit. The manuscript was 120,000 words. I delivered it to Conrad's agent with a smile, with professional pride, with the particular performance of a ghostwriter who has captured her subject's essence. Then I made sure it leaked. Not directly. I was careful. Years of forensic work had taught me the value of plausible deniability. I sent the manuscript to a true crime blogger I had cultivated, anonymously, with a note suggesting it might be of interest. I sent excerpts to a journalist who had covered my father's awards with increasing skepticism. I made sure the publisher received a copy from a concerned source before Conrad could approve the final version. The blogger published first a detailed analysis of the explosive autobiography that revealed shocking evidence of plagiarism and possible foul play. The journalist followed with a feature, the ghostwriter who wrote her father's confession. I had not told her I was his daughter. She found that herself, through records I had made sure were accessible. The publisher panicked. They had paid $2 million for a book that was, essentially, a legal document of fraud and a case study of murder disguised as suicide. They tried to pull it, to edit it, to demand changes. But the manuscript was already public, already discussed, already being analyzed by linguists and lawyers and the particular machinery of internet justice. Conrad read it for the first time when the blogger published. I know because he called Ava screaming, threatening, demanding to know what I had done. I listened. I recorded. I said nothing. Then I hung up and forwarded the recording to the journalist. He gave an interview the next day, desperate, trying to control the narrative. He was filmed in his apartment, surrounded by his awards, his books, the particular props of his constructed life. He said Ava was unstable, that she had misunderstood his intentions, that the so-called evidence was interpretation, not fact. I was in the audience. Not as Ava, I had shed that skin. As Vesper, his daughter, the woman he had not spoken to in 5 years, the linguist who had built the case against him. When he said my daughter never understood my art, I stood up. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply read in a clear voice that carried to every microphone the final paragraph of the manuscript, the paragraph I had written as my mother's voice, recovered, restored, finally heard. I did not give everything I had. I was taken from. I did not ask for forgiveness. I asked for justice. I was a woman who noticed sparrows, who argued with grocery clerks, who described light through windows at 4 p.m. in October. I was not silent. I was silenced. And the man who silenced me has spent 20 years selling my voice as his own. This is not suicide, this is erasure. And erasure is the slowest form of murder. The room was silent. Conrad was frozen, his practiced grief replaced by something real, fear perhaps, or the particular horror of a man who has finally been seen. The police did not arrest him that day, but they reopened the investigation. Not for murder, the physical evidence was gone. My mother's body cremated, the pills and the bathtub long since cleaned. But for fraud, for plagiarism, for the particular violence of stealing a dead woman's voice and selling it as art. He lost the National Book Award, not revoked, but reconsidered in a ceremony where the committee acknowledged ethical concerns. His publisher dropped him. His film option lapsed. He moved to a small town where he was recognized sometimes, pointed at, whispered about. He wrote one more book, self-published, unread. He died 2 years later, not violently, just slowly, the particular diminishment of a man whose voice had been his only power and who had never had a voice of his own. I did not attend his funeral. I published my mother's real journals, not the thrillers Conrad had stolen, those remained his, legally, tangled in copyright law I could not untangle, but her real writing. The bird observations, the grocery lists, the descriptions of light, the argument with the clerk about tomatoes, the sparrow on the fence at 6:47 a.m., 3 days in a row. The book was called My Mother's Real Voice. It was not a bestseller. It was not optioned for film. It was read by women who recognized their mothers in it, their grandmothers themselves, the particular recognition of women who have been told their observations are charming but not serious, their voices too small to matter. I restored her garden, the one Conrad had let die after her death. I planted salvia, which attracts butterflies. Last spring, I watched an oruga become a mariposa on a branch, and I wrote in my own journal, not my mother's, mine, the one I had finally allowed myself to keep. My mother did not commit suicide. But she did not survive either. I survived for her, and sometimes survival is as close as we get to justice. I did not write her ending. I only made sure that the world heard her beginning, her middle, her voice in all its particularity before someone else could rewrite it. I am Vesper. I am 31 years old. I spent 15 years learning to hear a voice that had been silenced, and 8 months writing a confession in the voice of the man who had silenced her. I am a linguist, a daughter, a writer who understands that the most dangerous thing you can do to a plagiarist is make him speak in his own words, because he has none. If someone wrote your mother's ending without her permission, if they took her voice, her observations, her particular way of being in the world, and made it their product, I need you to know. Her voice is still there. In the journals she kept, in the stories she told, in the particular frequency of her presence that no forgery can replicate. And you can learn to hear it. You can learn to speak it. You can learn, finally, to write your own ending. See you in the next story.